Anyways, then I'm going to introduce Rachel up here. Rachel actually, very brave soul. Why? Because she accepted my invitation to moderate this panel. So I'm really thankful for Rachel to do that. Many of you know Rachel. She's a professor in the physics department. We're so glad she's here. Anyways, I'm going to hand the mic over to her, and she's going to take over the next step. So thank you, panel, by the way, for doing this. And Rachel, thank you for moderating.
That's you, 'cause that is yours. Oh, no, that's Ted Ken's mic.
All right, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, so thanks Joe, thanks Sue for this invitation to moderate this lovely panel here. I figured we will start off with introductions. So maybe just a short introduction, start with name, position title, research area or expertise, and then maybe something fun like favorite thing at MSU.
Excellent. Okay, well, I'm Ryan Sweeter. I'm a professor of chemistry and chemistry education. I spend my time over in Lyman Briggs College, so our science residential college. My area of focus, some of it is on sort of curriculum development, curriculum design, and certainly embracing a lot of the three-dimensional learning, part of the three-dimensional learning team that's here. Also do a bit of stuff that's focused on just broad student success. I think that's most of the business things, and then there's the something fun that I really enjoy about MSU. It's hard to go wrong with the dairy store, though. I did teach a course that met right next door to it for a semester or two and had way too much ice cream, so too much of a good thing sometimes.
Hello, my name is Clauso Mathis. I'm assistant professor of physics at the Lyman Briggs College with Ryan. I also joined with Teacher Ed. I'm a part of CREED also with Science Ed. Similar to Ryan, but instead of chemistry, I do physics, so I do a lot of culturally relevant approaches to physics instruction. So I look at things from curriculum design, assessment, I look at things from teacher identity. And so Ryan took the dairy store example, so I think that was the example I was thinking about as he said it. So I think for me, I like the nature. So I came from Florida State for my PhD, so we didn't have that, like the river going through campus and stuff, so that was kind of unique to me. I like it, so I think it's a very naturistic campus, so that's one of the things I like about MSU.
Hello, my name is Jamie Long. I'm a professor in the Department of Plant Biology. I have kind of two camps of research. I haven't really been active in my plant research recently, but might be looping back to it in the near future. But from the science ed perspective, my research is focused on how students reason with visual information. So generating representations such as models and how they think about systems and biological systems. For me, the best thing about MSU is the trees on campus. So I'm with you on the natural area, but the trees specifically, that is my heart. So that's funny.
Hi, my name is Alicia Alonso. I'm a professor in the Department of Teacher Education. My background is in physics, but I work with pre-service teachers now, mostly elementary pre-service teachers about teaching for social justice. I guess maybe also relevant to Noah's work, I did do some work with a course that was focused on helping undergraduate students to know about science and how science is conducted, so thinking about science literacy in terms of the idea of practices and what people might use from science practices in order to engage with information in the media and other places in their everyday lives. My favorite thing about MSU is doctoral students. I'm just stepping down as the PhD coordinator for our program, and I think the graduate students are amazing and brilliant, and that's my favorite thing.
I have, yes, mine's attached. Okay, so yeah, when Joe and Sue asked me to do this, I asked, well, what's the structure? And they were like, well, you choose. And I was like, okay. I prepared, 5 to 6 questions that I shared with the panelists, and then I figured if there's time, we can open it up to the broader audience, and you all can ask some questions that are on your mind. But we have about an hour, and so let's get to it. So Noah got me thinking a lot with his talk, and he talked a lot about how trust is relationship dependent, involving, and contextual. And so noticing from your introductions and doing a little bit of research on each of you, you all come from a pretty different research background, right? So my first question is, in the context of your science, what does the word trust mean to you? And has your definition of trust evolved over the course of your career? And anyone who would like to start?
Okay, since I did that to you, I guess I deserve that. So I guess maybe I'll just start by saying like my transition to education from physics was an educational measurement where we think a lot about things like reliability and validity, and those are as important aspects of trust, but now my work is almost all qualitative. And so trust actually has like a meaning in qualitative research, so we think a lot about trustworthiness as a key way of thinking about qualitative research. It includes things like author's positionality and how that is or isn't acknowledged as part of the work. And so the goal is not to remove ourselves from the work, but to be transparent about who we are and how that impacts how we do that work. So for example, one of the fabulous grad students, Grace Takura, is doing her doctoral dissertation on an online community of Black girls and women, and she's a long-term member of this community. So she's really uniquely positioned to do that work in a way that other people would not be. And so that's an important piece, not that she shouldn't do the work because she's too close to it, but because she brings something important to that. And so in qualitative research, I think trust means that people know enough about your research to be able to judge whether they think that you trust that you came to the findings. Not necessarily that like if they looked at the data, they would come to exactly the same idea. So I think the idea of replication is not as big in qualitative research, and so because of that, one of the biggest shifts for me in moving from physics to education was just how much longer the papers are. So papers are really short in science. It's easier to establish that trustworthiness, and then in education they are very long because there's a lot of detail that you need to provide to do that trustworthiness.
I will confess that I haven't actually really thought a lot about trust in science, and especially from my disciplinary perspective, with the exception of things like Alicia just mentioned. It was always about, are your measurements reliable? Are the predictions that you've generated, what's the probability of those predictions? I will say that the PhD work that I did was related to climate change. So I studied climate change responses in plants. And so in terms of trust around climate change, that has definitely taken a kind of a roller coaster ride in the 30 or so years that it's been since I originally did that. So I recall at the very beginning of this that folks that were pursuing climate change research were very not trusted. And there was a lot of information in the media and coming from various organizations and groups that were dispelling thoughts about what climate change impacts were. I feel like then we gained some ground and that there became some public trust in the climate change research, particularly when we started seeing the effects, and that the effects and the impacts that were predicted so long ago were actually coming faster than what had been predicted. But I think it's all kind of up in the air now. So I think that there's kind of a mix of what we see out there. I wanted to acknowledge a definition of trust that my graduate student offered up to me, Michelle Weston. Raise your hand, I acknowledge. So when I said that we had to talk about trust and it was not something I had thought about, and she said, well, how are you going to define it? And I said, I don't really know. And she said, well, you could always go to counseling psychology. Counselors would define trust as, are you going to be there for me? And I really liked the way that that was phrased, especially in the context of what we're talking about today and about thinking about inclusion and who's being involved in those relationships that Noah was speaking to. Are we going to be there for those folks? And is that a way of thinking about how to frame trust? So I don't have an answer, but I like the definition.
That's a good question.
Thank you. I kind of agree a lot with what the previous two people had mentioned. For me, and I'll be brief in my answer, for me, there's a credibility element to trustworthiness in a sense of does the person or do the people that you do research with show that you have evidence behind what you're saying. There's also the relational aspect that the speaker had mentioned in terms of does this person feel valued? Do you value their opinion? Do they feel valued by the work that you do? Also one other thing I was on my mind, I can't remember. So there's the credibility, the relational aspect of it. I can't remember the last name for some reason. I'm stuck right now, so I'm just going to pass the mic over. I'm sorry. Let's go.
I think I struggle with some of the same things of like, how do I think about trust? Because it has always been something that I think has just been sort of implicit, that of course you trust science. As a scientist, you trust the scientific method, you trust the places that it'll lead you to. When it comes to our interactions in the classroom, because that's often where I'm thinking, there's often that effort to build intentional trust between the instructor and the students, of that aspect of will I be there for you, and will I support you in your needs as you're growing as a learner. And so that's always been there. And so for me, I think that there has been a change, which is to see this lack of trust in institutions, in science in general that we see more broadly. That's a new shift that I think I'm still kind of grappling with and personally finding challenging, because again, it's something that's just been so integral to who I am and how I developed and the career path that I opted to take, that I still struggle with some of that aspect of why would people not believe science? Often it's hard to think of what are the other ways of knowing that have shown similar levels of improvement, but then at the same time you do learn about some of the indigenous ways of knowing and how that's gotten to really complex knowledge and develop that over time. And so that has helped me see that there are other ways of knowing that can also have a kind of trust that's there. But then again, can you trust both of those, or how are they different? What are the strengths of each? Those then become some of the interesting questions.
Yeah, great. So I heard a lot of ideas about trusting the science, but for me, right, there's a difference between trusting the science versus trusting the scientists. And so my next question is, in the face of the political attacks on science right now, how do you maintain the credibility while also being transparent about the uncertainties and the evolving nature of the scientific knowledge that you're generating?
So one of the pieces that I think really strikes me about this is something that Noah had mentioned in the question and answer, which is I think we do have to recognize the limitations of science. We have to recognize the flaws. We have to recognize the uncertainty that exists. It's not something we can just say, science told us that this is true, right? There's always caveats, and that can actually be really challenging to get across, right? And sometimes that level of uncertainty or doubt, or the fact that we see science changing over time, right? Or it's really the conclusions, right? As we get more evidence, we should expect that there are changes to the things that we take for granted or the things that we actually believe. And we can see that in places like nutritional science, maybe more than anywhere else, where one thing is good for you, then it's bad for you, then it's good for you, as we understand the physiology of what's happening more and more, right? That you're taking the best guess that you have at the time from the data and the evidence that you have. And so I think that trying to help people really understand that is a process, right? And that change in science isn't necessarily a bad thing. It is a part of the process, right? And that sometimes there will be things that we find, or we think we found, that end up being wrong. That is a part of the process, but the self-correcting nature of science over time is something that is really important. So I think that's a really complex idea to get across, right? It's much easier to just distrust science because I can say science was wrong here. It's a lot harder to say, well, that science will get some things wrong along the way, but in general, we'll get better as we go.
You want to go?
I mean, yeah, I think just to piggyback off what Ryan said, I just think you have to be very transparent, be very vulnerable in the sense of recognizing limitations, be explicit on what you did to the reader, to the people that you're conveying the information to, but also show your vulnerability, show your weaknesses, show where you're confused at, and that sort of establishes, as we talked about in the previous question here, establishes trust with the community. And so I think if you do those things, I think that'll help in terms of maintaining trust and credibility with the people.
I'm going to go a slightly different route here. So this is not necessarily anything I've adopted in my professional context, but the lesson that I've learned and the kind of attitude or behavior that I've sort of adopted is a response to my family, in fact. So I grew up in the southwest part of Michigan. It's very conservative. It's extremely red where I grew up, and I'm a daughter of very hardcore religious evangelical traditions, as well as having a stepbrother that belongs to the Michigan militia. So the way that I frame what I do, I have to be very careful about that, I guess, in order to not alienate or in order to, maintain some peace in the family. And the tact that I think that I've adopted is, I think one of the reasons that scientists are not trusted or that we're suspicious is a lot of times we have a very arrogant attitude in the way that we talk to others. We sort of talk in a way as if we know what the answers are and other people might not be intelligent enough to understand them. And I think that that's highly ineffective, super inappropriate, and I think we're suffering the consequence of this. So I try to frame it in terms of analogies that relate to them. Virtually everyone in my family is from a manufacturing or trades background or farming. So I talk about getting a PhD as equivalent to getting a German's card in the trades that they're in. I talk about when they ask me about credibility or trustworthiness or something that's related to that topic, it's usually not quite in those kinds of terms. It's usually a little bit more crass than that. But I try to build analogies like, well, I'm not the right person that you should come to if you need to fix your car, because you know darn well that I don't know anything about engines or how my car works. But I'm going to come to you for advice about that because I know that you know how to fix the tractor. So it's kind of like trying to find ways to build my trade in a way that is analogous to their trade so that we can talk about our occupations in a similar kind of approach and using common language and talking about how it is that there are variations among individuals. I don't trust every mechanic that I've ever gone to, but there are some that I do, and they can think about science and scientists in exactly the same way. We don't know everything about science. The little bit that I know about science is pretty darn narrow, but they can count on me that if I don't know the answer, I'm going to find it out, and I have no reason to bluff them or try to pull anything over on them. So I think it's kind of the framing that we should do when we talk about the work that we do and what we know and understand relative to them.
So I'm going to sort of take it in the direction that you did, in terms of thinking about relationships and individual people, kind of level of relationships. And one thing I was really thinking about, Noah, when you were talking was this idea of appropriate respect, but then respect being a two-way street, right? And so what respect are we giving to other people in terms of our, sort of like expectation of respect? And so I think, for example, about, one of the examples was a patient in a doctor's office, right? So the extent to which that doctor is actually listening to the patient and what the patient knows about their own body, right? And how that leads to all kinds of issues like a higher mortality rate for Black women in childbirth, for example. And that there doesn't seem to be a two-way street in those kinds of cases. Also thinking about the ways that science has appropriated indigenous knowledge and not given that the respect and acknowledgement. And so thinking about that also being a place where, in some ways, like respect needs to be earned, but also given for that idea to make sense. And then the other thing I was thinking about too, though, is this idea that I think when we talk about science a lot, we mean like contemporary science, the science that's being done right now. But a lot of what people learn in K-12 schools is actually science that's been done a really, really long time ago. And so how do we think about those people, especially when they have perhaps problematic views about race and other things? And how do we think about contemporary science and what we want people to understand about the problems with that? But also just a difference between, science being evolving, but it doesn't mean that like our understanding of gravity is probably going to change substantially at the level of what a K-12 student learns. So.
Yeah, thanks. No worries. And thanks for that transition, because my next question actually revolves around what Noah was saying about, many of the scientific topics that are up for debate are actually, old conflicts that are flaring up, time and time again. And so the next question, so within your field, how have cultural and historical factors shaped public perceptions of your science? And in what ways should these influences inform the way we communicate about science in today's world?
So I'm definitely going to take this in a different direction because I don't feel like I have much to say about the question. I feel like one thing that's really important to think about is sort of these identity markers, and that people aren't often making decisions because they've gone and looked at the research and have like figured out what their opinion is, right? You have particular identity markers, and you believe the things that people with those same identity markers also think. And so I think one important thing is just to acknowledge how much identity is tied up in that, and how much people's beliefs about science are tied up with political beliefs and personal identity beliefs that are influencing how they engage with science ideas that we're presenting. So to take it to sort of not research, but the work that I do a lot in my work in teacher education is thinking about the way that we've been trying to portray science to pre-service elementary teachers as being flawed and having these issues, in part so that they can understand that science has this history that we need to acknowledge, especially when thinking about working with children from marginalized communities and how their views of science might differ from those from the communities in which we grew up. Also thinking about other ways of knowing, so thinking about indigenous ways of knowing the science that they do in their lives too. And so partly I was thinking, when you were talking about the difference between science is institutional science, and then the other kinds of science that take place, in non-Western spaces, in places where people are engaging in science, but not through an institution, and the extent to which we count that as science as well. And so trying to sort of have them view science in particular ways, and I think both of those things actually help pre-service teachers to identify more with science, because when we present it as this perfect thing, then it's not accessible to somebody. But if it's like, it's a flawed institution, we have agency to try to change it. I think that's an important way to address it, and maybe partly to start to get people to see science as not something that's separate from them, but something that is part of their lives, even if they're not engaged in institutions of science.
I think this is a really complex question, but I'm going to take just a very narrow and specific instance. And I'm going to draw from what I do in the classroom. So one of the things that I have done increasingly over the years is when we're talking about these complex issues like climate change, is I spend a lot more time now talking about the methods than I used to. So I really feel like it's important to make sure that when we're talking about the data and the patterns and the trends, that students can see for themselves how these things actually are measured. And we hand the data over to them to let them explore themselves. So I feel like, I hope, I have no evidence for this, but I hope that giving them some autonomy over the questions that they ask with the data in hand and knowing where that data came from, as well as involving them in data collection themselves, will help impart trust. So we're at the very early phases of a project where we're actually going to explore what is the consequence or what is the impact of having students collect their own data versus handing it over to them from another source. So my hope is that this will do something, even if it's something small.
Yeah, I think for me, like as was said, there has been historical injustices through science. There's been studies that said certain groups of people are inferior, or there have been studies where people have been, treated, tortured wrongly through quote-unquote what's considered science. So I think the public knowledge of this has created this major distrust amongst many people in society and scientists. And so I think kind of what we talked about previously in terms of being very transparent in what you're doing, being vulnerable, that's another way to sort of bridge the trust, in addition to some things that have been previously mentioned in terms of valuing other ways of knowing, valuing other people's epistemologies around certain science ideas and scientific concepts. I think is another way to sort of build trust again with this population. Yeah.
I think I'm going to pass on this one.
Okay.
I just don't have anything to add. So.
Yeah.
Great, thanks. So those first few questions that I had asked you all to think about were in the context of your own expertise. So if we take a different lens and say, okay, how can we work together or cross-discipline to build this appropriate respect or trust in the public eye. So my question to you is, how vital is interdisciplinary work to building or verifying trust, and how can we work together to gain trust from our public audiences?
So I'll take a crack at this one since I'm holding the mic now and just passed. So in this kind of context, I think one of the things that's really important is the fact that we are all doing science, that we're using the same sort of methods, and there's a reinforcement aspect to that, even just above and beyond the interdisciplinary places where we might be able to bring our knowledge together to help develop trust around different issues. But just the fact that we're using the same methods, we're using the same approaches, again, I think can reinforce it, particularly in the educational systems. Right, once we move sort of beyond that, we think about where individuals are coming from, I think it becomes a little bit more challenging, other than the fact that we are trying to tackle these really important interdisciplinary things, right? So if we talk about climate change, if we talk about pollution, like those are things that require multiple different disciplinary perspectives to come together. And I think that that's something that's really valuable to show how we can actually advance knowledge through these interdisciplinary works, but also figuring out what are the other groups that we need to pull in. So hopefully it's not just scientists who are doing this, but how do we link up with historians or artists or other groups that may have different ways of developing knowledge, but also sharing knowledge, right? How do you get that message across of what we should do to solve a problem or inspire people? That's often a place where something like the arts can be much more impactful. Much more so than just scientists saying, hey, here are the facts. If you can have someone who's actually able to tell the story, again, that's something that someone can really walk away with in a very meaningful way.
I don't know if I have much to add to that. Yeah, just bringing more people together, sharing ideas, increases the likelihood to tackle a lot of the problems that we have. As Ryan had just mentioned, also in addition to just not necessarily bringing scientists or official scientists to the table, maybe bringing other voices in to bring perspectives in, to bring new ideas, new information to sort of tackle the issues that we have. And that's a way of building a trust amongst interdisciplinary groups. In addition, you can build trust with the population doing that way also.
I think my answer to this question and the next one might be a little bit blurred, but you were talking about adding artists and people like that. I was thinking also outside of science, thinking about people who specialize in media literacy, because I think a big issue is how we engage with the information that we have. So not necessarily that each person is going to be going into the journal articles and reading the article and deciding what they're going to trust, but also just thinking about that they're getting their information from somewhere and how are they interacting with that information and deciding what of the various things that they're going to trust. Again, recognizing that that's also very often determined by identity. We look at particular venues and we don't trust other ones depending on our political views sometimes. And then also just thinking about the importance of political scientists in all of this work, and that because right now we can't seem to separate the scientific and the political, that it's important to sort of maybe have those perspectives as well, and thinking about how do we sort of advance this idea of appropriate respect for science.
Great. Yeah. So before I turn it over to the audience, I do have one more question, since we're all scientists and educators. My question to hear your thoughts is, given the growing complexity of information ecosystems, so there's social media, information flies fast now. What role should we as science educators play in helping all citizens develop the skills to critically assess the credibility of the scientific information that they have at hand?
So I already said part of this in my previous answer, but I think I'll go back to this idea of, I think when we think about the NGSS, it's often thinking about, students are gonna know how to do science and then they can do science in their lives. But I also think that that's probably not realistic. So if I'm a parent trying to figure out a treatment for my child, I'm probably not going to go out and do some science to figure that out, right? I'm probably also not going to go back to an original journal and read it. I'm going to get it from other information. So partly thinking about evaluating sources maybe. I mean, there's some things that you might expect someone to say I read this study about this thing about diet and it was conducted with 9 people. You might trust that less than one with thousands of people. But beyond that, I think another challenge is that information is often presented to be intentionally misleading, and so that sort of media literacy becomes almost more important than the sort of ability to interpret specific scientific information. And so, so I guess maybe I'm leaning towards this idea of like science can't save us, but there may be other ways of supporting people and making sense of the information that they're encountering.
I think that this is also a place where having others involved in the science, being very inclusive in the science is an opportunity for us. So I have a lot of hope for community engaged projects and for citizen science and for opportunities that actually get folks involved, whether it's in the classroom or in the neighborhood, the local community, involved in the entire process, and in a way that respects their contributions and their knowledge, and not in a way that, here, I have this project and I would like you to collect data for me. Not that, but actually welcoming their input, letting them drive some of the decision making. That I think we need to show that this is an open space and science is for everyone, and it's fun, and it's, you know, it gives us joy and there's opportunity for discovery, rather than science being something that we beat each other over the head with and claim hierarchical positioning in society. So that's where I'm gonna sit with that one.
Yeah, I like the notion of community engaged projects. I think the use of AI now is very good in terms of helping people get information, to be more critical about what's been told to them. Use of media is very good right now. I mean, like I think maybe 20 years ago, YouTube wasn't around. Now it's around. So people can have all sources of ways they can get information to, if they want to assess what's been told to them. And so, yeah, so I think the new wave of technology is very useful and very critical in terms of, you know, having the population assess what's true and what's not true.
Yeah, again, I think I would say a lot of the same stuff. I think the skepticism that scientists tend to take to things is one of the best things that we can kind of share with our students. Just kind of always being a little bit skeptical, you know, asking those questions. Where did this information come from? Where did this data come from? You know, asking questions about what's going on, I think is really critical. So I do think that's probably really useful. Not quite related to that because this was your last question, so maybe I'm going to cheat and ask a little bit of a question of the panel or other people. Listening to Noah's talk, something that really struck me is when we're thinking about some of the issues in which the public are sort of being impacted by science, it's one thing to say, like, people can kind of make their own decisions, right? You can have appropriate respect and you can try to use science in the ways that make sense for you and your situation and the circumstances. But how do we start to deal with that on things that have negative externalities, i.e. things like the decision to get vaccinated or not, right? You can be impacted by the direct impacts of it, but when you then all of a sudden have a whole bunch of people who say, I don't want to vaccinate my child because I'm uncertain about that, and then you get outbreaks of the measles that wouldn't have happened previously. It's interesting to think about, like, how did science weigh into the decision about what you were doing for your child, and how do we recognize that different people may have different thresholds of why, you know, how much do I trust the science, how much would I use the science, how much respect do I give to the science, and, you know, make different decisions. So how do we sort of respect individuals' choices versus sort of those collective things that impact us? And we could certainly come up with lots of examples if we wanted to think about that a little bit more. But I don't know if that's a question for the panel, just something to think about, but it was something that was kind of running through my mind as Noah was giving his talk.
Anybody have a response to that?
I think we should ask Noah.
Seriously? It's interesting to ask whether science has anything.
The question of how we weigh individual goods against public goods is a philosophical, moral, and political question. I'm not sure science has an answer to that question. I think that science can point out to us when things have particular sorts of consequences, and that we have a weight in the decision based on how important we think science's perspective on that issue is. So people who see, people who are vaccinated. So first of all, I want to be really clear. Most people who chose to vaccinate their kids before didn't do it because they had a thorough understanding of science. right? As long as we understand that. It's like most of the time, the decisions that people make, most of the people who believe in the reality of anthropogenic climate change have really no grasp on the science behind that at all. And this includes most scientists who believe in anthropogenic climate change but are not climate scientists, have very little grasp on the science of that at all. So it's important to not mistake people making decisions that are in alignment with particular scientific evaluations of risk and benefit with them understanding the scientific basis of those decisions. I think that the question of whether science speaks to, people are going to have diversity of opinions. When you speak to public health in a way that restricts people's ability to make choices for themselves, that is a valid approach as scientists to take. You could say that I think people should be required to vaccinate their children in order to send those kids to public school, and I'm going to lobby for that. I think that they should not be allowed to own assault rifles because of blank, 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 and I'm going to lobby for that. Whatever it is, whenever you're making a claim about the restriction of other people's behaviors on the basis of evidence, you have to respect the fact that those people are going to respond to your intervening in the public sphere, in the political sphere, in a way that affects their choices, right? So yes, I think science absolutely has a role to play in shaping political decisions that some people are not going to like, right? That's a big and important role of speaking hard truths. Lord knows if we can't do that, what can we do, right? At the same time, we need to recognize that when we choose to take that step from what we know about consequences to what role that should have in individual public political behavior, that we are entering a sphere of political decision-making, and that other people are going to respond to science in consequence of it.
Thanks. So at this point, I think I want to open it up to the audience. Ted has a microphone, so does anybody have questions for our panelists that have come up for you? Do we need to think, pair, share? We could do that. We all know what that is.
I just have a comment.
Go ahead.
I just have a comment. I appreciate what you've shared about arrogance and how that communicates and, you know, what it does, like when you insult someone's being. I think we lose the conversation in many areas, and I appreciate you sharing that. And I like your examples as well. So I think that's even in sometimes even how we convey, like through comedy, you know, just talking from different groups, even coming from my own background, like I'm a, Indian American. Our parents don't get the joke when it's patronizing. They sense the patronizing, insulting, like, why are you watching this? But they don't really get there is a good meaning behind it, but the way you went about it, it's insulting, and that's, it's not coming across culturally, because everyone, no matter what culture, you can sense when you're insulting them or you're being arrogant, or maybe you're even insecure, or maybe you're trying very strongly to put a point, but you're not really listening, and I just appreciate what you shared.
I think I saw a hand in the back, yeah.
Thank you. So I'll tell a bit of a story, right? Back in 2022, when I was in the UK doing my master's degree, and that was COVID time, when I arrived in the UK, even before I arrived, my daddy said, Lucky, you have to be careful about the COVID vaccine, innit? They are made for black, they're only made for white people or black people. It could affect you in a certain way. This was the perception my dad is creating in my head about COVID vaccine, right? Even when the COVID vaccine came down to Nigeria, I could see the negative perception of people around it that is here to wipe out the population of the black people in Nigeria. is going to cause a bit of infertility. They are trying to reduce the population of people in Africa. Conspiracy theory. Well, who am I to say that is a conspiracy theory or not, right? But these are the so I'm just going back to what we are saying. These are the perceptions of how maybe our fathers, our parents are having about sciences. So with someone arguing about the way sciences have to be taught, the way we engage in sciences, how do we appropriate respect in these regards based on this perception, based on probably multi-million-dollar NGOs or Bill Gates is funding these things and they have alternative opinions? How do we how do we engage people in such a way that to see that this is not bad in quotes or this is good for them? How do we appropriate respect in this part of public opinions about race, about wiping away this population, about these conspiracy theories? Yeah. So this is my question.
Thoughts?
I don't think I got what your question was. That was a great example, but I don't know if I know what question you're asking. Could you just repeat that?
So I think my question would be like, based off of the story I said, how do you appropriate respect in these regards for these individuals that have this perception that COVID vaccine is not good for a black person, they only made it for white people, or it's going to wipe away the population in Africa, it's going to make you infertile? Yeah.
I can take a shot if you want to.
I thought you wanted to take a shot. So it sounds to me like your father had a perspective on scientific institutions that was wrapped up in his perspective on other sorts of institutions, colonial institutions, for instance, institutions of white power and white supremacy, for instance. And it so happens, the very first vaccine, there were different formulations for working class people and wealthy people. So there's a long history of different vaccines being formulated differently for different people, back to the origins of vaccination. And that's, so that there's a history there. We think about the different components of appropriate respect, right? The history plays large. Relationship quality plays large, right? And particularly if you don't see there as being a personal urgency, if you weigh the risk of COVID as being, it could be bad, but probably not so bad, then that history and that relationship quality will be the things that determine the degree of respect that you give to the scientific institution in that case. I think it's from the scientific perspective, from the institutional perspective. If you think about appropriate respect as having these different factors, and you have the weight of history to push against. You know that history is telling a lot of true stories, and those true stories are ugly stories, right? Then how do you balance that if you want people to account for science, to weigh science in their decisions and their explanations? What are the other aspects of it? Do you need to change their understanding of the urgency of the situation? Do you need to change the relationship quality? What are the other things that you can change, those components of appropriate respect that people can integrate into the picture that they have with history? And if we think about appropriate respect as being something that's dynamic, that changes over time, recognizing that you're not going to get there tomorrow. So what's the next step? Is it building a trusting relationship between an institution and the population through things like participatory science that enables them to see how they contribute to knowledge, how they benefit from it? Then maybe that becomes part of the equation that is so overwhelmingly shaped by history in so many cases.
Also, do you want to add to that?
I don't necessarily know if I have anything to add. Yeah.
Or a different thread?
Yeah, I don't just, like I said, I don't necessarily know if I have, maybe a different thread. I just think, like, as Lucky had mentioned, the history of the world, the nation, has created this distrust. This historical injustices has created the distrust. And so, us as scientists, we need to be more and more and more constantly transparent in terms of, okay, what's the benefit of taking the vaccine? How did the vaccine, what came into the development of the vaccine? So be very transparent, be very, very explanatory in terms of why we're doing this, what they're taking, what are going to be the effects of what they take. And I think, given that, like I mentioned earlier, that the history has created this mistrust. So it's for us as a scientist to sort of work towards rebuilding that trust. And it's gonna take time. It's gonna take years, decades, maybe even, I'm not gonna go centuries, but maybe even a century to do that. And so that's just something that us as scientists, we we're gonna have to do to sort of account for the injustices that have occurred in society. Right.
Thanks. Other questions?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah, go for
I
it.
was just
Sorry.
gonna build on that a little bit because you caught me with the tail end of the question that you asked about how do you engage with that. And we're all science educators in this room, and one of the lessons that I remember that was really important to me when I became someone who is in the education space was to remember to meet your students where they are and to connect with them on that, whatever that commonality is. And I feel like that is something that we would all be willing to take in the classroom. We would never ridicule one of our students for asking a question that they thought was stupid, right? We would try to find where is that baseline understanding that they possess and try to build from that outward. But we don't do that in this public sphere. And I'm going to use an example that's extremely controversial, and you can shut me down if you think this is a bad one, but I think I'm right on this. Okay, so during COVID, people jumped on, Trump made many statements, right, that were not scientifically plausible, right? One of them was when he was advising people to take ivermectin, horse pills, remember? So this got a lot of traction in the media. It got a lot of traction in comedy. It became a joke, and it was a source of ridicule for him. So I'm not suggesting Trump was right on this. I'm not going to say that at all. But what I'm going to suggest is when this was all kind of unfolding, if you search on PubMed and look at ivermectin, it has antiviral properties. So that's one thing. So why wouldn't it be plausible to explore a substance, a medication, when we're in this desperate mode looking for anything to help us get through COVID? The other thing is people were making jokes about this because they say, well, it's a horse pill. You know, he's telling people to take horse pills. Have any of you ever looked at the medications that you give your cats and dogs? You'll recognize them. So we take a lot of the same medications. So I'm not in any way advocating that Trump had a good policy position there or that that was a good idea, and I would never suggest to anyone, go ahead and take the pills that you're giving your horses out in the barn. I would never say that. But we should have met him where he was. We should have taken the moment and used a little bit more dignity rather than be so reactionary, because we have this propensity to ridicule most everything he says, and I think that most of us probably secretly agree with good reason, but that is something that actually has fueled the negative perception about us as scientists. So what those of us who, or those of us who are not in the scientific profession might be looking at scientists and saying, well, they just think that they know everything. It's kind of looping back to this theme of the arrogance and patronizing, that we're not taking that moment to meet folks where they are, because there are fragments of understanding, there are fragments of rational reasoning there that we could take up and explore those and come to a more sensible, more dignified course of discussion than what actually happened there, and maybe we'd have a little bit more credibility in that space.
I think just to follow up, I think both what you're saying, I think it's important also to acknowledge that like the harms that science has done are not just in the past, and they've happened a long time ago, and now we fixed that, and to acknowledge the real harms that people are experiencing every day, and to have that be part of, like, I think this appropriate respect idea is that like people's respect is going to be conditioned on the way that they see science interacting in their real lives, and so I think, you know, a lot of these things we might say, well, that was a political decision. You know, Flint water crisis was a political decision. But that's not what it looks like to somebody who is having water coming out of their tap that they can't drink, right? So it's thinking about how science is really impacting people in both positive and negative ways, I think.
So I'm not sure if this is tangentially related but it's what I think about whenever we have these conversations about kind of the arrogance and respect thing. Because the lack of science or the treating science badly is also weaponized against, right, vulnerable people. Like, for example, what's happening in the UK with trans kids and trans people. And so part of it's like, I think it's this wrapping up in the liberal community with the scientific community, but like this kind of anti-science is being weaponized against people. And so how should those people deal with that and still be this humble, we should treat everybody with, you know, that all your ideas are good, kind of anti-deficit mindset. It's, I think it's not as simple as saying like, we're the scientists and we, we're the scientists and we have the answers and we need to build this trust, but like, how do you do that when you are being attacked, right? And a lot of people in the scientific community are vulnerable people who are being attacked by anti-science.
You asked a hard question, Jennifer.
I think the word arrogance gets thrown around an awful lot. And I think that it has in part to do with communication norms and in part to do with our conviction about where truth comes from and how one should approach truth. Y'all saw Ryan Stowe give a talk recently, right? I'm trying to convince Ryan to get the chemistry department to make t-shirts that say, I only eat chemicals. But we had this back and forth around the idea of arrogance, which is, how do you respond when somebody says, I try to avoid eating chemicals, right? Because let's acknowledge that, like, from your perspective, that's a ridiculous statement, right? And the humor comes from your way of understanding that statement. But the way of understanding, the way that statement is intended is I try to avoid eating synthetic food additives, which are known carcinogens, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to say, right? And I think that I don't think that it's required to assume that all of the ideas that are being thrown at scientists are good. I don't think that it's required to accept at face value even that Trump was doing anything other than repeating something that he'd seen in the worlds when he said he's ivermectin. But someone else might have had that idea that was grounded in the extension of a medicine which exists, which might be used for different purposes. That's happened a lot in history. So saying, what does this mean? What does this claim mean from the person who's making it? And on what basis? So first of all, I guess, thinking about safety, in the way that safety guides a conversation. I think there's an extent to which you are under no obligation to have a conversation with someone who is threatening you, right? And thinking about the mutuality of respect, someone who is approaching you in a way which is not respectful, is not your obligation to approach their epistemic system with respect. But if you want to try to have a conversation with them, if you believe that it's possible to forge some productive interaction with them, then the next step of not how do I evaluate that statement from my own position, which is a very nuanced and wonderful and robust position, but what does the person who's saying that thing that seems ridiculous to me mean by saying that thing? I feel like arrogance in these circumstances is often an emergent property of the different things that we mean, of that fish for baskets trading zone where we mean different things with the same word.
Additions?
I think we have time for maybe one more question.
They're in there. Right there, right next to you, Ted.
So one thing I've been hearing a lot in this panel are words like as scientists, right? And even in terms of
community engaged like science projects and things like that, there seems to be, right, some type of delineation between scientists and the public and so forth. And I'm not saying that there shouldn't be. And I've thought a lot about this in math, but not necessarily in science. And so I'm wondering if you can maybe elaborate when we're talking about public trust and respect, about how exactly are we defining who a scientist is, and who like lays claim to that authority of knowledge, right? And I imagine that definition, right, will look very different for folks. But when we're talking as scientists or as part of the scientific community or as part of the scientific institution, what are like those delineations from others? And when we think about things like pedagogy, right, like how are science teachers like included in like the occupation of scientists into our students extended and so forth, if that makes sense.
I can answer because we sort of think about that a lot in working with pre-service elementary teachers. So as I mentioned, we do try to expand their view of what science means, and maybe going back to the example from Grace's dissertation. Right? So the Black women in this community have done a lot of experimentation with their hair to figure out what are the best products, and some of this has been, over centuries that people have been experimenting with things. Right? So there's, in that sense, this, we say, science has an empirical basis, but so does a lot of other practices that we don't consider like as institutional science in that sense. And so I think recognizing the science that takes place in some of these spaces that isn't institutional science, right? So it maybe part of it is just distinguishing, like there's this Western institution of science and there's also science in lots of other places. And so partly wanting our elementary teachers to help their students see science as being something that's accessible to them, but also just really wanting to push back on this notion that the only people who can do science are people at universities or people with PhDs and that kind of thing. So. Sorry.
So one thing that I might add to that is I actually think the mantle of scientist is something that individuals actually don themselves. I think they decide whether or not they are, whether or not they view themselves as engaging in the scientific method. And part of that, the reason that I actually say that comes from interviews with undergraduate students of whether or not they viewed themselves as scientists. And actually what I found is a whole bunch of students don't. They would not view themselves as scientists until they had some sort of external credential that meant I'm a scientist. Typically that was an undergraduate degree that was in the sciences. But then if you ask, but some of the students separately decided, oh no, of course I'm a scientist. I use the scientific practices all the time. I do all these things. And it didn't matter if they were in a research lab or they were just doing things on their own. So I think that there's an aspect of helping people see that when you are doing science, you are being a scientist. And that's something that can happen in different spaces. It can happen in schools. It can happen outside of schools. But reaffirming that that is something that you are doing. You're engaging in that process, which makes you, by definition, a scientist. I think is something that can be very empowering. And again, some people will just put that on naturally, and other people wait for someone else to bestow it upon them.
In the sociology of science, there's this idea of boundary work. And it's a historical and sociological deconstruction about how scientists have established and defended boundaries over what constitutes science and what doesn't constitute science. It happens all the time. They are big, bloody fights. There is a famous one around phrenology, a famous one around astrology, around alchemy, a famous one around the NSF trying to figure out whether it was going to fund social science. The framework for K-12 science education trying to consider whether it was going to consider computer science and social science. Boundary work. That boundary work happens in the world, and it's in tension with our desire for pedagogical reasons to establish students and teachers as scientists. And I think that although it's wonderful for us to try to extend that identity, it's important for us to recognize that, as sociologists say, sometimes expertise is about who is allowed to claim to be an expert, rather than how much you know or what you're doing. So there are multiple ways of being a scientist which are present. We can at the same time say, you as a student are a scientist when you're doing your own research. But we do a different sort of boundary work when we talk about people who say, do your own research on the internet. And our desire to be expansive in how we label science and what we consider to be science and doing science or being a scientist is often really uneven in that respect. We like to be expansive in some respects and not in others. And no matter what we do as educators, as teacher educators, as educational researchers, there is an institutional reality out there which bites in multiple senses.
You know, he's not going to pay attention to time. It's 2:30, in which we were supposed to break. So why don't we give our Rachel and the panel and Noah one last big applause for being here. Give yourself a big applause as well for sticking out today. I know some of you were here when I was here at 9 o'clock, so thank you. I hope you found the days engaging and learned something valuable in our discussions regarding truth and the scientific enterprise. So thank you, Noah, for being here, and thank you, panel members, and Rachel for taking part in this. Have a good rest of the afternoon. Again,